I want to begin by acknowledging that the entirety of this Keystone was written on and presented from the sacred and unceded territories of the Squamish and Tsleil-Waututh First Peoples, also known as Squamish, British Columbia, Canada. I am a white woman of settler descent on these unsurrendered lands, and I'm so grateful to work, to learn and unlearn, and to live and love here. If this acknowledgement feels unfamiliar to you, I encourage you to learn more about the traditional territories you are on right now. This presentation is guided by the questions, what are cycles of violence and how can they be disrupted? I pose these questions because they are not often asked, and if issues aren't addressed at their roots, they continue. Hello, my name is Elle O'Brien. My written Keystone delves into many topics such as trauma, healing, masculinities, and various forms of gendered violence. But in my time here today, I look at the root causes of specifically male-perpetrated violence. In leading this exploration, it is important for me to note that men are not inherently violent, and that this is also in no way a means to excuse acts of violence. My intention is to start a conversation to humanize people who perpetrate, a demographic that is highly stigmatized in society, so that perspectives can be reframed from centering punishment to focus on healing. Where did this all start? In early March of 2020, myself and a good friend volunteered at a conference called the Crosshatch Forum. The goal of this event was to address gaps and barriers to creating an effective response to sexual assault in the Sea to Sky corridor. At the conference, there was a panel that detailed a scenario of sexual assault and the common response that follows. In this specific scenario, there was a woman in the Sea to Sky corridor under the pseudonym of Evelyn in a location about a 30-minute drive from where I am speaking this right now. She was experiencing violence in the home in the form of verbal, physical, economic, and sexual abuse from her male partner under the pseudonym of Caden. Her partner misuses substances like alcohol and drugs, and both Evelyn and Caden are Indigenous. After a traumatic instance of violence in the form of sexual assault where 3 of her ribs were broken, Evelyn called on a crisis line connected to the House on Women's Center. Through these resources, Evelyn was able to receive support and be placed in a temporary safe home with her 2 children. Her partner, Caden, was arrested and incarcerated in a BC prison and given a 6-month sentence, as is customary for cases like this. Caden and Evelyn maintained contact, Caden was released, and within 4 months, they had fallen back into patterns of abuse, where Caden was then incarcerated for a second time. There are a few different cycles of violence at play here. First, we see the abusive cycle of intimate partner violence. In Canada in 2018, intimate partner violence accounted for about 1/3 of all incidences of violent crime reported to the police, of which men consist of 85% of the perpetrator demographic. The most common recommendation from gender-based violence prevention organizations to break the cycle of violence is for the survivor to leave the relationship, to get a restraining order, or for the perpetrator to be imprisoned. At this conference, this was the recommendation for this situation. Additionally, we see the cycle of prison recidivism. Prison recidivism is when an incarcerated person is released from prison, repeats the action that placed them in prison, and is reincarcerated. Recidivism rates in British Columbia fluctuate between 24% and 40% for men convicted of these crimes. These recidivism rates show that prison as an intervention for cycles of intimate partner violence is not necessarily working. It is extremely important for people to have support and resources to leave situations of abuse. But there is often a lack of conversation around the perpetrator regarding what caused the violence and how the current system is not actually interrupting these cycles. In the rest of this presentation, I focus on the perpetrator archetype that Caden represents to look at the root causes of perpetration. A foundational phrase of trauma-informed practice is, hurt people hurt people, meaning that the perpetration of violence has roots in previously experienced trauma, and that hurt people will continue to hurt people unless the cycle of violence is disrupted. Trauma psychology shows a strong correlation between traumatic experiences and future violent criminal behavior. In trauma-informed rehabilitation and restorative justice, Judith Udshorn says, boys who witness or experience domestic violence are at greater risk of perpetrating it in the future than those who do not. Many studies also show that most men in prisons have witnessed or experienced multiple types of trauma, and that prisons themselves are very traumatizing places. Shame also plays a big role in the perpetration of violence. Trauma specialist Dr. Vanderkolk says, deep down, many traumatized people are even more haunted by the shame they feel. They despise themselves for how terrified, dependent, excited, or enraged they felt in a particular circumstance. Feeling shame can be intolerable and overwhelming, and people try and replace it with the opposite, the feeling of pride. This pride is often achieved through dominating or a feeling of winning, which one can achieve by enacting physical or psychological violence on another, which ultimately has to do with power. So when you feel as if your power has been revoked, you complete an action where you feel as if your sense of immediate power has returned. I would like to use this as a point to transition to power and the influence of toxic understandings of masculinity on the use of violence. There are gender norms at play in society for how people should be and act that are socialized, internalized, and upheld by the dominant social culture of a particular place. A hegemonic type of masculinity is a dominant, socially accepted, and celebrated stereotype for how to be a man. It is a particular masculine ideal to which all men are inadvertently compared to, of which conforming to often results in achieving a sense of social power. Though hegemonic masculinity plays out differently among individual men, in Canada, a patriarchal and colonial context, characteristics of hegemonic masculinity often support violence. This includes stoicism, heterosexual success, dominance and control over women, and physical strength. Under these expectations, the lines between sex, power, and violence become blurred, and violence over a feminized other is often validated as a means to help sustain one's masculine power. Violence is thus a mechanism through which some men can prove their masculinity, and performing acts of violence leads to a socially accepted depiction of masculinity. Under these norms, emotional expressions of care, love, or vulnerability that all people feel are often feminized and deemed bad, thus suppressing the emotional self. This suppression is also connected to trauma. So, are these gender expectations themselves traumatizing? In a book about trauma and gender, Mira Atkinson describes these social norms as inherently traumatic for all people, socially condoning traumas like rape and other violent crimes. Now, if we come back to Caden's story, we see multiple cycles of violence at play that reach across time and space to be concentric and interlocking. We see the cycles of intimate partner violence, childhood victimization, expectations of hegemonic masculinity, prison recidivism, and there are other cycles of violence too that I'm not speaking to due to time constraints. In these cycles, hurt creates more hurt, until there is something that sparks personal transformation or healing. Let us return to the conference where this all started. The Crosshatch Forum was designated as a space to make improvements around responses to sexual assault in the Sea to Sky corridor. This notion of humanizing perpetrators was not in the conversation at all until, at the end of the panel, a female elder from the Lillooet Nation stood from the audience and said, "My question is, where are the resources for men?" She said, "Our men are being left behind, and so the cycles of violence continue." I would also like to acknowledge the various cycles of violence from colonization that she's speaking to here as well. This question, though, shifted my perspective and has acted as a guiding force for me over the past year. My written Keystone is an attempt at answering her call through the design of a social issue intervention proposal for Squamish. This is guided by the question, how can we create systems of support for incarcerated male perpetrators that interrupt cycles of violence? The program I propose is informed by trauma and gender and addresses a gap identified by myself and those working locally in the field. In conclusion, in order to truly break cycles of violence, the root causes of the violence must be addressed. There needs to be an attention to perpetrators that examines trauma, toxic gender norms, accountability, and healing. Please look at my written Keystone if you want to learn more. My final words are that cycles of violence are fed by this idea of having power over something or someone else. But power is not bad. In feminist theory, power is seen as energy, capability, creative force, and collective empowerment, where you can have shared power that grows out of relationships and healing, and that stretches across differences. This is called having power with. All of these issues I have talked about provide a challenging opportunity for transformation. With this in mind, I would like to leave you with the question of, how can we reframe our perspectives and understandings from one of power over to power with? Thank you.